So, for quite some time now, I've been seriously bothered by some of the discussions that we've had in terms of software development, especially during the summer of 2020 when politics and the lockdown boiled over into everything in our life, including work. And so, one of those things that's been frustrating to me is this effort to take words that have historically not had any sort of negative connotation with them and then imbue some sort of negative connotation to them such that we cannot even use the word at all anymore. We must rename every instance of it and flog ourselves for using it and never again make the same mistake. And one of those words is the word master. Now, the counterpart to master is the word slave in a master slave architecture. That's a prevalent term historically. For example, Jenkins uses it to describe the controller node versus the agents that actually run the work. So you had the master and then multiple slaves. And obviously, the word slave has some sort of negative connotation to it, at least insofar as it describes something that is abhorrent. And so there were efforts, for example, way back to 2016 to take the term slave and rename it to agent. So that work was underway long before the summer of 2020. And then in the summer of 2020, there was a renewed effort to not only rename slave, but also to focus on other terms like master, and whitelist, and blacklist. And speaking of white and blacklist, those two words are confusing. So at a minimum, we should rename them to allow list and deny list just because that makes more sense. That's regardless of whether or not they're offensive to somebody, though obviously the connotation of white with positive or allow and black with negative or deny, that's definitely got some racist undertones to it. So sign me up. I am happy to help with that. That'll be a win-win all around. But then when it comes to the word master and perhaps even slave, because that's describing an architecture where you have a controller and the controllee, I'm not so convinced that we really need to be changing anything there. Is that word in and of itself describing something or even connoting something that's got negative undertones to it? I don't really think so. And of course, even if it does, the question becomes how much is it going to cost us to go back in time and revise history to get rid of references to these words historically? And who exactly does that benefit? And then once we figure that out, we should do a cost benefit analysis to decide if we're going to go back in time and revise history. And to make my point, if I come just to the Jenkins project here, to the tracking issue for renaming slave, which is something that dates back to 2016 or 2017, if you look at this issue, you're going to notice that there are parts of this that are still open. In fact, there's still a lot of work to be done. And if I click this link here to search for the word slave and all of the Jenkins CI organization out on GitHub, there are over 6,000 references. So obviously, there's still a long way to go, and this is 8 years later. And naturally, a lot of work has already been done. So the question really becomes the thousands of hours that have gone into just this one Jenkins project and renaming the word slave to agent and master to controller, and that's not even done yet. Those thousands of hours or tens of thousands of hours that are necessary, what could we do with that time instead? And would that maybe be more beneficial to anybody that was possibly offended by what these words represent? And I ask that question honestly because as a gay person, to this day, I can recall what it feels like to wonder, would I be fired if my boss finds out that I'm gay? And so having some sort of right to my job, even though I really would never want to work for somebody that hates gay people, having a right to my job, though, means a lot more to me than perhaps somebody not using the word gay anymore, just because it has some sort of association with name calling or slurs historically. And so somehow everything would be just perfectly fine and peachy for me if people just stop using the word gay and erase the entire history of using it. That way I never have to hear that word again or even see it. And of course, I'm being sarcastic here. The point is, in many ways, it's actually pretty offensive to suggest that the tens of thousands of hours of time that have gone into this are somehow supposed to make me a happier person when I know that time could have been put to much better use, even improving Jenkins itself or dedicating that time to some other effort to actually improve the lives of somebody that's been discriminated against. So instead of just blanket bans and rewriting history, I think it would make a lot more sense if we actually focus on the words themselves. As I said with black and white list, not only are they confusing, but they also do have negative connotations to them. But when it comes to the word master used alone, in terms of creating a default branch in a Git repository, that's not even a reference to master slave. In the context of a Git repo, the closest definition for master is going to be an original from which copies can be made. It's the master branch. You fork off of it or you branch off of it. and then you bring things back when they're ready. It's the primary branch. There is no undertone referring to even master slave when it comes to a master branch. It's just a word that's been used for a long time in terms of versioning code. And because of that, we definitely don't need to spend time rewriting history, especially as expensive as that can be when it comes to a Git repo. Instead, we should focus on whether or not going forward this is the word that we want to use. And if it's not, then we could figure something else out. And honestly, I have no problem with the word main. I think it's perfectly sufficient. Right here, you can see it is the chief part or the essential point. That's exactly how master is being used. That said, making a change is not free. It's not necessarily cheap either. In fact, you're likely to break a bunch of tools that depend on the master branch being there by default. Ironically, Jenkins is one of those. And furthermore, if you look at the definition of master, there's nothing in any of these definitions that prescribes or suggests that slavery is a good thing, nor do any of these suggest anything negative at all. They're all descriptive definitions because master is largely a descriptive word. And then there are other uses of this word that are pretty important. For example, mastering a skill. What word are we going to use for that then? Are we going to ban master outright? And then one thing that drives me crazy is this gaslighting that happens that suggests that the word master is non-inclusive. If you want to talk about how it's non-inclusive, you have to explain to me how exactly it's not including people or how it's offending people. And of course, offensiveness is subjective. But if we're going to get down to the root of it, it's got to be one of the definitions of the word, or it has to be a common usage of the word that's considered perhaps vulgar for us to just blanket deny the ability to use the word master. And if the definitions don't matter, well, then the only way that you can implicate master is that one of the definitions describes something historically that we find abhorrent, and therefore the whole word is related to that just by the syntax of it, never mind the semantic. And if that's the case, then, well, technically speaking, if you come down to synonyms, in the list of synonyms, you're going to find the word main. And that suggests some sort of relationship whereby if we're going to corrupt all of the word master and throw it away, well, perhaps we also have to do the same thing for main. And so then we're going to need yet another word. And of course, that's silly because at the end of the day, we know that words have multiple definitions. And as long as it's not a vulgarity, what really is the problem with using a word to describe something, especially if it has historical significance to it?